Great. Well, welcome to this space again. I'm Marsha Davis. I'm the Executive Director of the Tzedek Social Justice Fund. And you may notice that we use the word Tzedek as part of our name because it is a Jewish word meaning justice. And we believe quite deeply in just giving. But I'll tell you a little bit more about our story as we move along. So this is the first webinar as part of our Bold People Magic Dreams webinar series. In 2018, we engaged in a community research process that surfaced gems of information for us and insights that we felt would be useful for other funders, nonprofit leaders, and other local stakeholders. So we are committed to not keeping this treasure to ourselves. We are sharing the information that we have learned, but we also want to share how this information has transformed us. So over the course of the next few webinars, we'll be sharing the data as it emerged around these topics of social justice philanthropy, sustaining impacted leadership, social justice activism in Asheville. Today's webinar, however, is focused on the transformation that we've gone through as an organization, how we spent the last 3 years implementing the results of this research, and a little bit of a deep dive into what community-based research is and how we've engaged in it. So let's get started. Some of you may have known us as the Amy Mandel and Katina Rodas Fund. And you'll notice that over the last few years, we changed our name to the Tzedek Social Justice Fund. And that name change is representative of a complete story of transformation that has emerged as a result of the community-based research and also some other racial equity work that we've been doing for some years. Our funder and founder is Amy Mandel. I'm excited that y'all all will have the opportunity to hear from her during our panel today. And I wanted to point out that Amy Mandel is someone who's been involved in philanthropy and social justice philanthropy in particular for some time. Since the 80s, she's been really focusing on providing funds for LGBTQ justice, racial justice, and combating anti-Semitism. And the way that Tzedek looked prior to all of our the research that we're about to share with you today, we actually engaged already in some trust-based philanthropic practices that were really supportive of grassroots leaders, and at least for us felt like we were walking our talk, right? We were engaged in multi-year general operating grants. The max was about 3 years for organizations. We also provided annual grants as well. We also, in terms of following the principles of trust-based philanthropy, before they were called that at that time, we're already engaging in a simplified and streamlined paperwork process where we reduce the burden of both grant reporting and proposals for our grantees, took on the burden of a lot of that internally as part of our staff as a way of making these grants more accessible to our potential grantees. And we also offered a flagship program called the Tzedek Fellowship, which some of y'all might remember. And the Tzedek Social Justice Fellowship provided the opportunity for emerging professionals to be part of local nonprofits, and we provided, the fund provided the funding for those salaried positions. And however, like most organizations, we definitely had room for growth. Like most of I think most other foundations and other nonprofits, we had a disparity that emerged in who we were and who held power in our organization. You may see in this picture, it's a very clear split in terms of what the racial and ethnic demographic was of those who were in power, our staff, and those we were serving or who were participating in our programs, our fellows. And one of the things that I deeply admire about our fellows in general is their commitment to social justice. And the last class of fellows, especially, you could see them pictured here, were predominantly Black and Brown, predominantly queer and trans, and they called us in. And we're speaking to the ways in which we were teaching social justice principles, but there were some gaps and some blind spots in terms of how we were walking our walk. And our journey really started with a racial equity audit that was led by the Attaway Group. and led into a revisioning process that was led by Tamiko Ambrose of Ambrose Consulting. She's here on our call as well. And Beth Trigg of Taproot Consulting, who's also on the call. And they led us as an organization through a revisioning process that included the community-based research process we'll talk about today. And again, we'll share the key results over the course of the next few webinars. But I think the part that's important to highlight is that we, along with a lot of the nonprofits that we fund, and in collaboration with really the national statistics about the demographics of nonprofits and funds and foundations, were involved in a lot of the hoarding of power among folks who were identified as white. And yet we were serving folks who were representing a totally different racial and ethnic demographic, right? And so this is a disparity that's actually seen in a lot of organizations. And that's part of the reason why it feels really important for us to share both the research and our transformation journey. Because one of the key insights that emerged from the research is that equity requires sharing decision-making power with those who are most impacted by the problems we hope to solve. There were, I think, a great many gems in the research, again, that we'll unpack, but if you're walking away with any one message, this is the overarching tone of the work and what the local leaders shared as part of this process. You have to share decision-making power. One quote in particular really stands out. If funders are really committed to social transformation, then they have to be willing to sit in the circle rather than being at the top, no longer being paternalistic. I wanted to take a moment and let that land. We as funders are usually used to being in a position where we consider ourselves the saviors who are performing some form of charity to those who were doing the work on the ground in our communities. And what became abundantly clear is that stance is not only is it not in partnership with those that we work with, it also wasn't the stance that made them feel the most respected. And if we wanted to be in collaboration with those who were doing the work, then we have to be committed to sitting in the same circle as opposed to creating these spaces where we hold all the control. So in response to that insight and other insights that emerged in the research, we've transformed in so many different ways. Let's start thinking a little bit about how our grant making has shifted. We continue to offer multi-year general operating grants. However, the maximum is 5 years. We've increased our financial commitment to walking in partnership with our grantee partners in the work that they're doing. We also started offering grants to individuals in direct response to the research where grassroots leaders said, you need to fund us for doing the work. You often fund organizations, and yet there are tons of us who are doing the work outside of these organizational structures who also need support. If you're interested in learning more about the grants to individuals, our third webinar focuses a lot more on that conversation. We also started engaging in community-led grant making. So we brought on 5 social justice leaders to be to start making decisions about where over a quarter of Tzedek's budget goes. And the idea there, again, is that we are sharing decision-making power and how we are distributing our funds. Let's talk a little bit more about sharing decision-making power and how that's emerging for us. We've really learned that if we are going to be in partnership with our grantee partners and not hold a paternalistic and kind of savior view, that we have to shift our stance from charity to solidarity, right? And so here's a little bit about how the decision-making power has moved in our organization over the years. Amy, at the start of this fund, held the majority of the decision-making power around both where grants went and what the strategy was of the fund. Over the course of our transformation, Tzedek staff then held that power. And it's important to note that unlike some other funds, Tzedek staff don't have a long history in philanthropy. All of us have come from doing some work in community, either through the nonprofit ecosystem or through the grassroots organizing ecosystem. So transitioning power from Amy to Tzedek was already in some way transitioning power to folks who are not seen as the mainstream lens in funding. It was transitioning power to folks that had a better lens and most likely lived experience of what it meant to fight injustices here locally in Nashville. But we decided that we needed to go even a little bit further than that. So we've split the decision-making power, both in terms of grant making and in terms of strategy with local community members. I already spoke a little bit to how we've shifted power and shared it with some community members through our community-led grant making process. But we've also shifted power by changing the structure of our board. Our board of trustees now contains 8 local social justice leaders who are based here in Asheville and have a long history in making change in our area, and 7 of whom are women of color. And as part of this transition, I think the most striking piece is also that Amy Mandel, our funder and founder, has stepped off from the board and allowed the board to have full power over and influence over where we move as an organization. And that's been a really powerful shift that we'll speak a little bit more about as we go through the course of the next few webinars. But we have really understood as a result of this community-based research process what the importance is of sharing power and being in solidarity with our grantee partners. And I will say, and I think most of our staff and Amy might say as well, is that this has really supercharged our impact. There are some very beautiful ripple effects that have happened as a result of these shifts that make us feel stronger as a funder and more respected and in deeper relationship, authentic relationship with our grantee partners. Again, you'll hear more about those details as we go through. Let me dive into how we've done the community research process. So we, the who, you might want to know a little bit more about who we were getting this data from. We selected 8 local leaders, 11 local leaders rather, 8 leaders in social justice philanthropy, and 10 host organizations and former Tzedek fellows who used to be part of our flagship Tzedek Social Justice Fellowship Program. And we interviewed them over the course of about 6 months, January to July in 2019. And the what is we asked questions of these leaders, and I'll show you a few sample questions in a moment. But these questions were also all vetted by a group of trusted advisors. Trusted advisors were another set of 11 social justice leaders in Asheville that gave us feedback on the structure of this research, what the questions would be, how we'd ask them, et cetera. And the how, we conducted 30-minute one-on-one interviews, and each person was compensated $50 to really honor the fact that they're coming in with consultant expertise that we might not have been able to access otherwise. And we felt like that compensation was really important in terms of being part of the process of making this less extractive and hopefully a more process that's filled with some reciprocity. Here are the few of the questions that we've asked. One was, what are some of the barriers that limit the community impact you dream of? What is needed to transcend those barriers? How can AMKRF, that was our old name, Tzedek, best support the leadership of those most impacted by systemic oppression? What do you feel is needed to advance and sustain movements and communities in Asheville? This broad range of questions were sent through interviews, and Tamiko, Ambrose, and Beth Trigg led those interviews to give folks the opportunity to say what they needed to say, both about what works for them in Asheville, what doesn't work, and what worked for them about Tzedek and AMKRF, and what didn't work. And so we had the opportunity to get a full range, you can imagine, of responses to these questions that then informed the next 3 years of our transformational process. I want to take a minute and show you a picture of our trusted advisors in action. And I wanted to show you that picture in part because I want you to see the joy that emerged in terms of bringing community leaders into the space to have these conversations. And the picture on the right is just one of the sheets of Post-it paper where our trusted advisors gave us feedback on the questions that we had designed for this research. And it's less important to see what the actual question is. And I want you to take note of all the little notes on the side, right? Where they asked us to define who is Asheville. What is it, looking at the terms of oppressive structures, telling us to name it. That feedback turned out to be incredibly valuable, not just in how these interview questions were framed, but they also gave us this important feedback about how to interpret the research and the findings that we had. We actually had a trusted advisor session where they were invited to look at some of the results from the interviews and help us to pull out key themes. So here are a couple of tips if you're thinking about moving through this process. And we'll have a panel discussion, and I think more of these beautiful tips will come from both Tamiko and Beth. But I wanted to share some of the tips that emerged for us as staff as we went through this community research process. One, compensate your participants. That is incredibly important. Most folks who are doing work in community are used to being asked for their feedback in a way that is incredibly extractive. They're brought into a space, they're asked for this information that is just jewels of information that's gold that you can really make some really fundamental changes based on. But then usually organizations will just be like, bye, walk away and not have any further communication. So at the very least, we ask that you compensate people for their time. We ask that you also engage in radical hospitality. That radical hospitality can look a lot of different ways. For us, it looked at like having these conversations in comfortable spaces, providing childcare when needed if we were having a larger group meeting, providing meals if we were meeting in person. And the idea there, again, is to help people understand that we want to be in authentic relationship with them, that we are open to whatever insight they may have, and that we also have a deep respect for who they are. We also ask that you be clear about how you plan to use the data. Why are you asking for it, and what do you hope will happen once you get it? Again, we provide that tip in the hope that you're to reduce the harm or the sense of extraction that emerges from these processes. We also found it useful to choose voices who are doing work that we respect and that we aspire to replicate. Of course, there might be some limits to that, but again, as you're going through a community research process, it can be really overwhelming to think about who do we invite into the space, who are we trying to listen to? And so in terms of helping you to narrow that down a little bit, we found that it was really useful to look at leaders who were engaging in grassroots work in some ways, or at the very least were providing programming services or doing some consulting work that was based in having a more progressive and radical approach to justice. I would highly recommend that you do not ask feedback on items that you have no intent of changing, right? I mean, that feels ultimately extractive, that you're asking someone to give their time and their expertise and to share in a process, but if you have no intent of changing it, that's actually inauthentic. And so that leads to the last and final point, implement that feedback. If you are asking for feedback and you don't make any changes based on it, you'll lose trust with community. And we have found that the best way to maintain these authentic relationships that we built prior to and during this process was that we looped back around and made changes, and that folks could see us learning in public and being transparent about the shifts that we were making in response to what they said. So I think that's about enough of hearing from me. I'd love to have you hear now from our panelists. And so we'll bring up Miss Amy Mandel, who is our funder and founder and has had a long history in philanthropy and has been one of the moving voices in this process and has really inspired us to really to walk our talk in more progressive and radical ways. And so Amy, welcome. Thanks for being here. Yeah. We'll bring on as well Tamiko Ambrose of Ambrose Consulting, who helped launch and guide this revisioning process, conducted along with Beth, all of those interviews, analyzed all of that research, but also has a really deep history in social justice work locally and participatory action and popular education work in general. So is a wealth of expertise and information. Thanks for joining us, Tamiko. Want to also bring up Beth Trigg, who was the co-leader of this process. I'm so excited that she's here. She's the founder of Taproot Consulting, also has a wonderful background in popular education work and nonprofit organizational development work, all of which came in handy as we went through this process. So hello, Beth. Nice to see you. All right, so let's dive in. And for those of you who are watching, please know that we'll have this panel discussion, but there'll also be time for Q&A at the end of the session. Well, you'll get a chance to ask them a little bit about their thoughts on this process, or any questions you might have on what it meant to run this process. But my first question, and I think I'll aim this at Tamiko, is why is it necessary to engage and keep engaging in community-based research? Don't we already know all the issues?
Thanks, Marsha. Good to be with all of you today, and to see so many familiar names, some of whom were part of this process. But to answer your question, I think I would first say that one of the main issues is that we might think we know the issues, but sometimes we actually don't really know what the issues are. Sometimes we don't even know the right questions to ask. And we don't know the way to frame the question, as you saw by that marked up flip chart paper. And so it's really important to not only just look at the root causes, but also not root causes, but not just the symptoms, but also to look at the root causes. And I think there's more of an opportunity there when folks who are most impacted are included in the process and are given power in the direction of the questions, the priorities of, what do we want to learn about? And I think also, community-based research or participatory research is also an opportunity to interrupt that traditional power dynamic of between the researcher and the researched, the funder and the funded. And so it's really an opportunity to really lean into disrupting traditional power dynamics that come up because we're all part of the structure, right? And so there are just more opportunities to look at ways of being reciprocal, to interrupt extraction and the ways that people's labor and contributions can be exploited. So there's so many different dynamics that are at play with traditional research. And so I think that participatory research, community-based research is really an opportunity that speaks to the values of, values for equity, values for liberation, values for justice. So that's what I'd say first.
Amy, what came up for you as part of that process? What felt like the attracting features for leaning into a community-based research process?
Okay, forgot to mute. First of all, hello everyone. It's first of all so fun to be able to be in this conversation with people that I love, but to see all the rest of you who are interested and want to contribute to this conversation, thank you. I think that for me, that question, like, why do it? My question is, why wouldn't you do it? If we really say that we want to serve the community, then we have to get a different perspective, especially for me. I mean, my motivation, the way I'm positioned as, class, race, wealth, my perspective is necessarily skewed. And I can read as much as I want to read, or it's just very different from hearing from people. And one of the things that I was really hoping, and one of the reasons we were so attracted to Tamiko and Beth, is like, how could the stage be set for people to speak frankly? So that, because we're funders, right? And a number of the people that were talked to, were polled, may have received funding, so to get that across, to build that trust. And then, as Marsha said, to know that at the end, the strong intention was to come through and implement anything we could, and or find other ways to partner with other people who maybe could implement some of those things, that it gave us a different role in the community. That was my hope. How do we be part of community? You know, I've heard Marsha and others talk a lot about various roles people have in social justice. And I love that quote about how a funder needs to be in the circle. It feels better too. It just does. You know. I'd love to know what reflections Beth has too.
Thanks, Amy. And hi, everyone. I think the first thing that came to my mind was just like having heard you, Amy, recently in other spaces talk about how much you learned through the process. And just first, like naming the openness to learning that you had and that the other staff had in the process, or that the staff and you had as the funder. That was a prerequisite, a really important prerequisite. And also that it was part of the magic. Like, and so having heard you say how much, like, name specific learnings that you took away, and then hearing Marsha kind of name the specific ways that Tzedek dramatically changed its practices, I'm like, yeah, we didn't know. Like, learning happened. And then the other thing is, like, I really was struck when I heard the question by, like, who is we? Because power and decision making in the world of funding has been so concentrated in the hands of so few people, and predominantly white college educated people, predominantly, like, all these other identities that we could name that I'm not going to laundry list right now. But I think, like, Marsha mentioned pop ed, popular education. Like, Tamiko and I start with the pop ed framework, which trusts that the knowledge is there, the wisdom is there, but it's a question of, like, who is we? So we start with the assumption that those most impacted do know what the problems are, they do know what the solutions are, and that it's about openness and listening and learning, and that openness and listening and learning was really key in the process.
Thanks, Beth, for bringing in the, like, popular education and the frameworks that were really informing the work. Because even though we call it community-based research, the framework is actually called, participatory action research. We use community-based research because we find that that's a little bit easier for our folks who are connected to us to understand what we were actually doing. But Tamiko and Beth, I'd love to hear a little bit more from you about what is participatory action research, and what are the ways that you have found it to be useful. I guess it's a three-parter, and what did you value about Tzedek's process?
Do you want me to go first, Beth? Gosh, so I think that one thing that felt so powerful to me is one, I feel like Tzedek staff did a lot of work internally so that they were, y'all were even able to receive and listen to what was learned through the process. And so there's this simultaneous work happening at the same time. And then I think also the learning from the research itself was really, really rich, and I think informed the way that I personally see the world. Like I've said, y'all heard me say this earlier, that I myself felt like I was experiencing transformation through the work because of what I was learning and being able to look at the world in a different way. And so, with community-based research, really participatory research, however you want to say it, it is this idea that there are different entry points that for folks who are, the participants to actually be partners in the process. And so, as I said earlier, informing the questions. In the case of Tzedek, the trusted advisors, which was the group of, was it 11 people, actually did the first layer of analysis of the data. Wow, that's like an opportunity to share power. Like, what is it? How are we making meaning of all these voices, and actually not being as founder funders or as a founder funder staff, very easily could be in the position of, okay, here's the data, let's decide what it means. But instead, placing that into the hands of community to be like, what does this mean to us? And then learning from folks who are part of that process. And so there's different ways of approaching participatory research depending on what it is you want to learn and who you want to learn from. Like, I've been involved with work that involves youth. I've gone door to door. So there's so many different ways of approaching this, but I think that what was particularly effective about the process with Tzedek, I think, was that staff was also simultaneously doing some work internally so that they could even be in a position to be like, hey, it's okay to trust the community to make meaning, to analyze, do this first layer of analysis. So to me, that was really powerful. And I think also that community-based research is really a vehicle for strengthening relationships and a vehicle for building trust. And so there's all these different things happening at the same time that I think made the work particularly powerful to me. What do you think, Beth?
I think the only thing I want to add to that is I want to just sort of paint a picture for people of what it actually looked like what the participatory analysis looked like, because hearing you talk about it, Tamiko, I think one of the most powerful things was this was pre-pandemic, and we were doing all this work in person, and because of confidentiality, we didn't want to digitally share raw data with people, and even in the trusted advisors. So we printed just like huge stacks of paper, stacks and stacks and stacks of like transcribed raw interview data, and literally transcribed, which is different than the way that like sometimes when Tamiko and I work, we're looking for summaries of interviews or focus groups. This was like word for word transcriptions of all the interviews that we had done. And it was giant stacks of paper, and people arrived with their backpacks and highlighters and and it was really hands-on. Like we literally handed them the information and handed the trusted advisors the information. And we had a participatory process for how it was analyzed, but also it was a circle process. Like that piece, that quote that came up about funders sitting in the circle, like we started with a chance for people to check in, and we did some work together that was connective and relational. And then Amy and Marsha and Heather and Lindsay, all the Tzedek folks were like in their hands-on with the community folks, sifting through data and like writing on flip charts. And so it was a very practical, like co-working, collaborative relationship building environment. And I think that was a really beautiful piece of it to me, and a piece that made the work really transformative and powerful, was watching that work happen in a real collaborative way. And I will say, the last thing I want to say about that is that I don't want to say that it was all easy and fun, because some hard stuff came out. There were some really difficult emotions in the room. There were tears shed. There was a lot of love. There was a lot of love expressed and a lot of connection, and there was anger. And so just to name that, the space included all of that, and that was an important, to me, looking back, reflecting on it, that was a really important part of how participatory research looked different than what I always thought research looked like.
Let's talk a little bit more about how this type of research looks different than what you think research looks like. I have a background in science, and so in my mind, it's always you know, like there's kind of this primacy of the scientific method where you as the researcher pull yourself out of the process. The people that you are getting information from are just these subjects that are far away. You're extracting information from them, and then they become these numbers, right? And of course, even if you're pulling qualitative data, that then they become these phrases and these stories or just key themes. And yet what I really experienced in this process that felt really powerful for me was that the research in and of itself was relationship building. When you talk, Beth, about the like crying and the hard moments that we had, those were hard moments that we were having together in a way that built like intimacy and connection with these leaders in a way that felt really powerful for me. So it was my first time being part of a research process where the process itself was transformative, that we weren't just trying to act as though we as the staff member or Amy as the funder had absolutely no feelings in the space, but that we were just one of the many, as opposed to being the people who are, controlling the work and keeping ourselves separate from those who are doing the work or sharing their information. So I'm curious for all the people on the panel, like, how did this feel different or unexpected for you? Amy, is that something you want to chime in on?
One thing I can say on a very personal level is it was so delightful to be one of the circle, because as funder, there's a way that can, not everyone feels this way, of course, but that can feel isolating from community. And to actually let myself be seen and show myself and see other people and take those kind of risks and learn was actually very transformative for me. And I'm sure there's other things in that question that I'm blanking on right now, but yeah. You asked what was the process like?
Yeah, and how did it feel different from you from a more stereotypical research process?
I don't think I could have learned what I learned without the relational aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
It goes in deep and it goes in different, and not everything gets resolved right away. But I learned a lot. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else on the panel want to jump in on that? How did this feel different from a more typical research process? Or conventional, I should say.
Oh, please, you go.
Marsha's going to kick me under the table. I just know there are people who are in the trusted advisors who are on the call. And so I would also be curious, like, I know that's later in the agenda, but I would love to hear like what their experiences were like of it. And I think there were interviewees on this call too. So I just want to name that and thank you all. For me, I think the only like really big thing that I would add to what Amy said is that like Tzedek gave it the space to be deep and messy. And most of the opportunities that I've had to do that kind of research before, there was a sense of less space, maybe more of a sense of urgency, maybe more of like some of the things that we would name as white supremacy culture around like how much we are willing to give in terms of time, energy, money into a process with learning, a learning process. So that was a real like positive, amazing difference that I saw, was Tzedek's willingness to invest time and energy and let it unfold.
Great, and thank you for the invitation. I mean, that's I think this is going to be an example of how Tzedek likes to flow with what happens organically and what feels right to the people in the space. So if you were someone who was interviewed or part of the trusted advisor group and you wanted to chime in or make a comment, please feel free to use one of the reaction buttons and raise your hand, and we'll see how to pull you into the conversation. We'll let this be an organic space. I think that's also a representation of like one of the newer Tzedek practices of being in relationship and learning in public. So thank you for the invitation, Beth. You know, so you brought up, Beth, like the feelings that emerged, and then you also brought up the work that we were doing internally to make ourselves ready to hold that feedback. So Amy, I'm going to come back to you because I think that was, for me, was a powerful process of watching us have some really honest conversations about the deep toxicity that comes with philanthropy. I mean, we did the reading Decolonizing Wealth, reading Emergent Strategy. That's what some of us were doing on the side, talking about how actually capitalism is really extractive. And if the world was the world that it needed to be, philanthropy shouldn't exist at all. That we would already have a society where folks had their needs met, and folks who with wealth would not need to step in to give these types of grants. And so I want to open the door for us to talk about some of those emotions and feelings or learnings that came up from the space. Is there anything that you remember that kind of sticks out for you, Amy, about some of the internal work we were doing?
Well, first of all, how you do anything has so much to do with what gets done. So we had a tremendous amount of learning to do, yes, but what about the actual relationships on the staff and how to develop even more capacity by trusting each other more? Because it was really, we were just coming together as an organization. It had been sort of separate things happening before. So there was a lot of that. And Tamiko and Beth led us through quite a bit of it. Some difficult sessions just with staff as we were becoming difficult, challenging, and woeful, and wonderful, and beautiful too. I mean, it wasn't, I don't want to just lean into the difficult part. So it changed actually who we were. Maybe it was the beginning of starting to equalize power among staff, and me not being quite as much in the center. That ultimately, I don't know that could have shifted completely unless I had stepped back, which is what I chose to do eventually. But I think that working on those relationships, some people say, well, that's a lot of time on soft skills, but I think it's what enabled us to do what we've done going forward. And I think the other thing, this was a long process. All of it. And even so, it's okay. How do you go slow? I think I've said this before, and you may have heard it. When the world feels like it's on fire, how can it be okay to go slow? But then if you do go slow and be intentional about it, ultimately, just like sustainable work conditions lead to more quote unquote productivity, the fact that we took the time to do that did bear fruit.
Mm-hmm.
So,
I feel like it's those emergent strategy principles, right? Of moving at the speed of trust, and that small is all. We really leaned heavily into that. But I'm going to push a little bit more, Amy, also because I know of the background conversations we've had. What did you need to learn in order to be comfortable ceding power and stepping away? I mean, I know that we're kind of talking about that as being the I think we're kind of saying it matter-of-factly, as though that is, of course, the natural result of this research. But I imagine that there could have been funders who heard the need to see decision-making power and would not have done that, right? Who would have at least, at the very least, held their role on the board. So what needed to change in your understanding of philanthropy or yourself for you to get to that point?
I think that, number one, there was something a little bit unique in that the people who were attracted, other staff, to the work had more skills at implementation, at systems thinking, at a lot of things. I mean, I can have good ideas. They need to be grounded in the reality of what's going on for people, and I can vision and brainstorm and maybe inspire. But some of the skills I felt more and more were more present among staff than they were for me. But if everyone was looking to me like, what's Amy gonna think? It just felt like it was stifling something. Number two, it became more clear that for this to be, I just felt like my voice has value, but it wasn't the right voice to be making decisions. So was that difficult? It was loss of the engagement when I ultimately did it. But I still have some of these relationships, some identity stuff, and maybe that needed to shift. What would really be effective if I've been given the gift of access to these funds, and as it became clear, we were still in the process of, we want this mostly dedicated to Asheville. Okay, if that's going to happen, how can it be used best and actually do what we say we want to do? And I continue to learn how little I knew. And even that process when we were analyzing the data, how skilled, just so much I could learn from every single person who was even analyzing data, and all the work they had done and experience they brought to it. I hope this helps to answer the question.
Yeah.
I
mean, what it brings to mind is one of the phrases we kept using, especially towards the end of the process, was that wealth does not equal expertise.
Exactly.
Right? That just because you inherited this wealth from your family does not mean that you know what our community needs in order to shift the needle on some of these really big, some systemic issues, right? And I think that especially in the world of philanthropy, as it conventionally goes, there's this assumption that because someone is coming in with the wealth, that the money came from their family, that they should be the ones to make all these decisions about where the wealth goes, that somehow the wealth magically gives you, information about grassroots organizing, information about like building a nonprofit. And so there are all these ways in which, our kind of oppressive capitalist, culture tells us if you have money, you're the one who has the expertise and we need to follow through with what you say. And I think what was really unique for me about this process was hearing you say, like, look, I know I have the funds, but here is all this amazing wisdom in the room. And that, I think, emerged also as part of the community research process, because you saw those folks kind of, taking that information and parsing it out in ways that you might not have done on your own. Yeah.
And it's kind of like, this is a lot of money. Whose money is this anyway? And so there is something reparative about dedicating it in this way and making it move more towards a community-based fund. Not, hey, I got some money, let me help. This is much more informed than that now. And I think it will continue to be. And I hope there's the bandwidth and capacity and funds to continue to engage. I was saying earlier, 2018, 2019, very different than 2022. Like, what's alive in the community right now? How is this looking? And so thank you.
Yeah. 2 more questions for you, actually. One is, I know we're focusing in. Well, I wanted to spend some time also, letting folks know a little bit more about the shift that you've gone through, because not many funders do it. You actually brought up this question of whose money is it anyway? Can you say more about that? How would you answer that question now?
Well, I appreciate the fact that my father earned enormous, he did the whole raise himself up out of poverty thing. He was in the right place at the right time. He was a brilliant man, but that's way more money than anyone earns. It's just goes in stocks, all the different things. And so who did the work that made the money? Not just the person on top, right? So it's always felt very imbalanced to me. And I'm not talking guilt. Of course, there was that too, but how does that shift back? So that was part of it. I also have one more thing to say about your question about what gave me the confidence, maybe, or the learning. It was you. It was Beth. It was Tamiko. It was the brilliant people, seriously, that were attracted to do the work, and I had the confidence that it could flourish without me. So,
Thank you.
Yeah.
Beth and Tamiko, can you say more? I'd love to hear your thoughts about who does the money belong to anyway? Who does it really belong to?
Me?
You go
ahead, Beth. I'll go after you.
I want to say, when I answer that question, I also want to say before I answer it that, like, I just want to witness Amy and say that, like, in terms of other funders thinking about what they would need to bring into a process like this, that the humility and the also like some analysis coming into it around power and oppression and wealth was really key in being able to move and shift change being able to happen. But I mean, my like short answer is as many of it is that, you know, resources have been extracted. Resources have been extracted from Indigenous and Black people and communities throughout the whole entire history of this country by owning class white people. Land has been stolen, labor has been stolen, lives have been stolen, and that all of that, even though I don't look at Amy's dad specifically and say, whose land did you steal? All of that is part of the system that his money compounded in. And that when he took the money he made in capitalism and used it to make a lot more money, that the system was built on extracting labor and land and lives from people in communities of color, Black and Indigenous people specifically. And so I know that Amy had some sense of that coming into this process. Like if I had said that to Amy 5 years ago, she would have been like, yep. like I know that because I knew Amy before this process. And so I knew that like that was not a concept that was going to, she was going to argue with, but that like working through what it meant for her as a white person with wealth to know that had to be part of this process. And honestly, that is like part of what was so transformative about it for me is like as a person whose ancestors literally did some of those extractive things and literally helped set up those systems, like reckoning with that in my own life and my own family as part of this process, which I, you know, continue to do, is part of what was transformative about it. Maybe that wasn't a short answer at all. Tamiko.
I think the only thing I would add is that that not only, you know, there's a tendency for organizations, foundations to look outward at the oppression in the world and the work they're trying to do to address whatever particular, you know, their issue is, the issue areas are. But that often we are in our work like replicating those very same oppressive systems. And it shows up in our relationships and the ways that we interact with each other, the ways that, power is distributed, where we're willing and able to relinquish power and where not. And so I think that the process, and Amy, I'll name you, like that, you know, not everyone would be willing, that is in your position would be willing and have the insight and willing to take the risk and to be vulnerable enough to trust in the way that you have. But I think, you know, the work has really been in like, what are the ways to interrupt the extraction? What are the ways to interrupt the ways that people are exploited? What are the ways that we can illuminate the voices that are so often erased? And so I think that that analysis piece and bringing that into not only, you know, programmatic work, but like our own, like ourselves, our relationships. And I think that work was happening inside of the research process and with the trusted advisors among staff. And I think it continues. And one of the things that, you know, continues to strike me and why I think it's important to name popular education is because change is not linear. Like it doesn't happen in a linear way. It's cyclical. And so now I feel like Tzedek is constantly in the process of adapting for the next season of change. And so maybe if we did the research process again right now, maybe the trusted advisors will look different. Maybe the people who were interviewed would look different. But so I respect and appreciate that openness and willingness to take those risks in order to, just lean into that unknown, that world of what we don't know that we don't know yet. And that there's a whole world out there that we don't know. And so Amy and I think staff, like folks, have been willing to be vulnerable enough to say, hey, we are not the experts. we don't know everything. And that is not how people normally show up that are in positions of power, whether it's in philanthropy, whether it's in, some kind of whatever role within the nonprofit sector. And so that's what I think is distinct about this process. And it doesn't necessarily answer your question about the whose money really is it? But I think that that was what I wanted to add to what Beth said.
Yeah. I mean, I think but it's all really juicy information, right, that you're sharing. And I wanted to also speak to, I mean, not an attempt to like hype Amy up, right? But in an attempt to talk about what I learned, right? What I learned in this process too, that was really important for me, is that this was the first time I saw a white person with wealth who was able to kind of grapple with the complexity of being of having some identities that are power identities or have more power, and some identities that are marginalized, right? I think specifically about your dad, Amy, Mort Mandel, who here he's the money that he has accumulated came after he had to flee Europe from anti-Jewish oppression, violent oppression, and came to this country. And granted, I think if we just saw him as a person with wealth, that would only be one part of his story. He's also someone who experienced kind of systemic oppression, right? And yet you're also holding that complexity too, of someone who identifies as Jewish, identifies as a lesbian, is experiencing systemic oppression on those fronts, but is also experiencing what the privilege is that wealth gives you, and the privilege of your white skin in this culture gives you, and then holding that tension. I've usually seen people either go one way or the other. Either they lean into the parts of their identity that are been oppressed, and they're just like, I'm an oppressed person, or they lean into the parts of their identity that have some privilege, and then they're like, yes, I'm a white person with privilege. And I think what is really important about the journey that we went through is that we acknowledged intersectionality, right? That Amy was able to acknowledge the places where she has privilege without throwing away the places where she may have been experiencing systemic oppression as well. And the reason that feels really valuable to me is Tamiko, when you talk about cycles and the cycle of change, that Tzedek, now we're in a position where here I am as a Black queer woman, a lot of identities that have that have been oppressed. But I also have to be very aware of the fact that, like, yes, I grew up in poverty. I'm a first generation American, and I have a job now in an institution that pays better than most jobs in Nashville do. And so, like, how do I acknowledge the new power that I've gained and the positionality in that? How do I acknowledge the privilege that comes in terms of being cisgender? How do I acknowledge the privilege that comes that being Christian in a world where a lot of our culture of our country is kind of in alignment with Christian values? That what I really learned through this process are the ways in which, hey, when you get some power and privilege, you have to be ready to cede it as well. And that for me has been a very interesting journey. Did not expect to be in the place of like, oh, wait a minute, I have some power, I have to share this. And I think that's where the iterative process came up, where Amy ceding power to the staff was not enough, right? I mean, that ceding power to folks who have been historically marginalized is one step, but that we still have to continue realizing the places where, when the system gives you power, your job is to spread it. Your job is to make more space at the table. Your job is to make this a place where voices that aren't being heard are being centered. And so this process that Tzedek has gone through is never going to be over. We're just going to keep like reiterating. And like Lindsay said in the chat, we had some very honest conversations around power and privilege. Who's holding it? Who is acting like they don't have it when they do hold it? And it was those conversations, I think, that has placed us all in a position where, hopefully this work will continue to change, and you'll see Tzedek continue to transform. And don't be surprised. I think sometimes with white supremacy kind of wants you to go to the perfect answer and say, I'm done, I did it, we're now perfect. And yet the reality is that when you're in relationship with community, it's just the beginning. Like there's just going to be a lot more shifting and changing, and you'll see us kind of adapting. And that doesn't mean that we don't have a strategy. It means that we're being adaptive and responding to our community, and that it's more important for us to honor those relationships and be prepared to follow the lead of folks who are most impacted. And that's actually for us, our theory of change is if we continue to follow those voices, we'll continue to have the impact and community that we want. But that might mean for those of you who are watching our journey that the Tzedek you see in 5 years is not the Tzedek you see now. Sorry, that was me getting on my soapbox about change. And I appreciate you giving me the space to do it. So tell me what advice you'd give to other organizations that are thinking about engaging in this research, or maybe they're feeling inspired by some of the transformations we've gone through. What advice would you give them?
Well, I'm not one of the researchers, but I can start us off with saying that I think what really helped us in the process to dive into it with the intention to listen and learn and know that you don't know everything, to hire people that know how to build trust and that we trust and that we know will give us the truth of what they're hearing, and can create a space, I might have said this before, where the people who are going to be participating in the research feel that they can speak frankly. And, it's like, if we, well, no, that I'm just looking at a note here, and that's more something that we learned. I'll just start us off with that. Those are some things. It's enormously valuable. It changed us. It will change you if you decide to do it. Yeah. And so you have to, like Marsha's whole talk on change, you have to be willing to know that this might change some things. Yeah.
I think just to echo what Tamiko said about do your own work, like don't expect that this is like a standalone track, but that doing your own internal work individually, collectively, as an organization, learning, analysis, building, reflection, that's a critical piece to accompany any kind of project of learning from communities.
I have one more thing to say before Tamiko, and I don't know if I said it or not, but if to do this, you actually have to really want to know, not just know that you don't know. And you have to be prepared to find out some things that you don't expect or you don't want to hear. Maybe half of your ideas of what you think is a good thing to do are going to go out the window when they're tested against community, and maybe not. You just don't know. So
that actually really aligns with what I was going to say, Amy, and that is, just really, like, what does solidarity really look like? Like, what does it really look like? Because so often accountability goes one way, it's like organizations or individuals being accountable to funders. But with humility, being able to be humble enough to hear if your brilliant idea that you've been, your baby that you built, or this, thing that you believed in is actually not working, or it actually could be causing harm. And so really just being open and humble enough to listen. And yeah, I love that. Is really powerful what you just said. Like, you have to be be truthful about, are you really ready to hear? Are you really ready to listen? And so I think that, yeah, for me, solidarity is just really being willing to be accountable to community, and to, yeah, and to acknowledge when mistakes have been made. And I think Tzedek has been really wonderful about that. Like, when things have come up and there's noticings of, "Oop, this is causing harm," or this brilliant, fellowship program we had is actually not the thing, like, gosh, how hard that must have been, so I just think it takes a certain level of humility and openness and willingness to take risk and to believe people, to believe what you hear and what you learn.
I think one more thing is, if, let's say, for funders on the call or people in organizations, make sure that not only do you want to know, but that you have staff that you have confidence are going to be able to implement at least some of what comes out of it. Because that's the way we're demonstrating back to community that we did hear, that, that this was real. So.
Yeah, I'm actually going to, pull in someone who was part of the trusted advisor process and is now on our staff, Ms. Libby Kyles, in part because I think there was something about that you have to want to know. I could see her face like, lighting up. But in part because, I think Libby's the perfect example of, we have to want to know, but you also have to staff up appropriately. And even though there were already folks on staff who had community experience, one thing I will say that Libby brought to us was like boots on the ground experience, like someone who knew about pulling together her individual community to make change that we didn't quite have on our staff in the same way, in that expertise. And so, pulled her in. Of course, there was a hiring process, but of course, like one of the things that brought her to the top was that experience. And here she is leading a community-led grant making process. But Libby, I'm pulling you in to say, to just share whichever insights felt right to you, but also what was popping up for you when Amy said, you have to want to know.
So I started snapping my fingers because that resonates so deeply with me. Oftentimes in these spaces, people are talking about, we need to learn this and we want to know this, but sometimes wanting to know is just sexy, right? It looks good that this organization wants to know, it looks good that they are striving for. But there's a difference in the sexy process of it and what it looks on the outside versus being intentional and being purposeful about what you're going to do with this thing you say you want to know, right? And I can only liken it to other experiences that I've had where people have asked me to be a part of something because they saw Libby, as Philip Cooper would say, change agent in community, who's bringing people in, yada, yada, yada. But then when it comes to moving beyond knowing and learning and taking the knowledge that you acquired and taking those baby steps to push back against what you've been doing and to transform your work, the magic goes away, right? It was all sexy and cute and fun when we were wanting to know, but now we're responsible for, now we're accountable, not to other people, but to ourselves for making changes and being transformative in community, because we said we wanted to know and we now need to do the things that need to happen because we've learned what we've learned. Does that make sense? Right? And that's one of the reasons I'm always impressed, and no one could have told me 5 years ago that this would be where I am. I'm so glad that I'm here. But even when I met Amy originally, it was through CoThink. And even back then, listening as she brought her voice into the room when we were having certain processes, you could always sense that there was an eagerness in Amy to be a part of community in an authentic way and not just be seen as the funder in the room, right? Mm-hmm. And there was sincerity in it. So when you say you want to know and there's no sincerity, and it's just because it looks all nice and sexy, it's different. And it's, people can see community can see, I'm not going to say people, community, those people who are rooted in community and know what they need in community, they can see the difference. So it's not just wanting to know, it's being authentically tied to what you're going to do with what you learn after you want to know. Sorry about that. That might have been a little long-winded.
Did you unmute yourself, Beth? You had something to add?
Oh, not intentionally, no. But I wrote, like when I was listening to you, Libby, just really powerful. And I feel like it's so much about accountability. And I remember the question coming up over and over again internally during this process of who are we accountable to? Who are we accountable to? Who are we accountable to? And I think that everything that Libby just said is so closely related to that, and that continuing to ask that question is just such a key part of it.
Yeah. I mean, it was the who we are accountable to question that I think that led to the board shifting the way that it did. Because I remember, actually, I was sitting next to Brittany Nesbitt, who was one of our trusted advisors and who was a former Tzedek fellow. When she asked that, she was like, okay, great that we're doing this process, but who's going to actually hold you accountable to doing the work that is uplifted in this process? And that was the moment, even for me, I had to turn and be like, oh yeah, who is holding us accountable? And that is actually really hard when you have a lot of privilege and power, especially as a funder, to find folks who are willing to hold you accountable, and who are not going to shy away from saying something to you just because you're the person with the wealth that might be granting them. But I also, I'll pause for a second. If you have any questions, get yourselves ready to ask them by clicking the raise hand button. And you'll see that on the bottom menu bar, there's a button that says reactions. Click that and raise your hand and be ready to ask some questions. But the last point I want to make before we open up the space is, I think what Libby shared was crucial about just going beyond the sexiness of wanting to know and going into the position of action. And I want to highlight that because I actually think that what we went through, the transformation we went through with the community-based research process, is actually really parallel to what a lot of local actual leaders say that they want to do around dismantling oppression, right? That usually we get stuck in the process of, let's gather more data. Let's make sure we read another book. Let's do another book group on the 1619 project, right? And then, you start to find out the way power plays out in your institutions, and you get a little bit of analysis paralysis and you don't move forward. And I think what I felt like we had practiced in these really small ways here at Tzedek is practice getting the information and taking little experiments, even if they're not perfect, being willing to make mistakes. We're moving against white supremacy culture in that way of letting ourselves be imperfect for the sake of actually allowing us to progress towards a more liberatory organization that hopefully can support more liberatory work that's happening in our communities. We had to experience ourselves what it feels like to dismantle systems of oppression within our organization before we could actually really walk our talk around supporting organizations and doing the same. So I think there's just this parallel with the community research process between what shifted for us internally, and I think what can powerfully shift in our communities if folks are willing to not just get information about where power is being hoarded, but actually do the work of seeding power and letting other people in community take that space. Thank you, everyone on the panel. I want you to stay up here a little bit as we field some questions. If you are in the audience and would love to ask them a question, you can do that one of two ways, raising your hand, or
Marsha,
if you
can
have
I
a
say
question, put that
something?
in chat. Oh yeah, go ahead, Tamiko.
Can I have one more thing? I was just in listening to Libby. I remembered being part of something recently, or in the last 6 months or so, and just hearing people's exhaustion of like, oh, I'm tired of being surveyed and these listening sessions, and then no one ever comes back. Never hear about it again. And so just naming that I think that is another difference between like the one-time wham bam focus group and then see you later or listening session, but actually like committing to just being in community through the whole process. So I just wanted to name that that part is true. Thank you.
Well, are we waiting for questions? I mean, I think that came up in the trusted advisor group at the beginning. Like, is this just, what are y'all doing? Is this just another focus group? And I'm wondering if Libby has anything to say about that, given that you were in that group. You know, like how that process might have changed from the beginning to the end for you.
Well, I'll tell you, coming into that process, that was my first question. Like, is this just another group? Because I've been a part of so many groups, and we ask generally the same questions in every group. And the point where it changed for me is when we put those questions up on the wall and then we started redesigning the questions. That's when I knew this was going to be different. I was like, oh, okay. So they really want to know, right? They really do want to know. And so when Tamiko and Beth were open to us rearranging and doing things a little bit different and, you know, breaking the questions down. I remember one question, it started one way, but by the time we were done, there were actually 3 questions that came out of that one that really kind of narrowed things down so we could really focus in on what we wanted to say and what questions we wanted to answer for the Amy Mandel and Katina Rodas Fund. So having that power, being a part of that process, that's when it shifted for me.
All right, we have a question coming in. And Michael, I'm going to ask you to unmute yourself to go ahead and ask that.
What, if anything, would you do differently next time, and why?
Isn't that what I asked you before, Tamiko? Yeah.
It is, and my answer changed since we talked about it earlier. Do you want to go first? What would you do differently, Amy? I'm curious.
I don't know that I would, because I think it's worked out really well. I mean, the only thing that I can think of that maybe could have been different would be either, and I don't think we had the capacity, bigger sample, not just people we knew. It wasn't just people we knew, but people we knew of. There's a lot of other people in Asheville. So
That's really, like, I was laughing because, like, Tamiko and I have talked about this, like, what would we do differently? And I think, like, I've grappled with that question of like midway through the process, someone said, did we talk to the right people? And I think like you started with the relationships you had. And so I sort of come back to like, well, that was the starting point. Like, maybe it would be a different list now, but so I don't know the answer to that question, but I'd say that's like something that I've wrestled with and that like we've talked about.
Tamiko, I'm curious about how your answer is different now. So like, what would you say now in terms of what you would have done differently?
Yeah, so just to let everybody know, before, as we were preparing for today's panel, we were having these conversations, and what I said about what I would do differently is I think Beth and I were kind of straddling this place of, you know, holding space for Tzedek to learn, to have agency, like to decide, you know, we had this whole like, the process for choosing folks was really, you know, informal. We wanted everyone to be able to pick people. And I think that, you know, what I said earlier is that maybe I would have pushed Tzedek a little harder to look for voices that are a little closer to doing, or more voices to folks that are doing work on the ground locally. And as Beth said, it was like starting with who folks knew, starting with the people in the room and with who people knew. And that maybe if we did the process now, it might look different. But I also think that I think it was the right group of people for the right time, and that it really was not who Tamiko would pick. You know what I mean? So it's like me like realizing that it should not be that the participants should not have been the people that Tamiko would pick if I had my way. And so that's part of why I changed my response to that question, because yeah, I think it would be different now because the context has changed, and that's you all started where you were at. So,
you know, I've been thinking about this process a little bit, and I think the thing that I would change is not so much the process, but how we communicated about it. I think we were really intent on implementing changes. And so here we are in 2022, which I think it's divine timing in the sense that we've gotten 3 years to implement changes. And so now we can actually speak to not just the community research, but the impact of the transformation. And yet I will say that, you know, one of the tips I gave was let people clearly know how you're going to use the feedback. And I think there were some parts as we were in trying to implement where we weren't, you know, I don't think it's a negative thing. We just didn't have the staff capacity, but I think we could have been communicating while we were also implementing. And I think that would have been something to also, it would have been interesting to be in community with other organizations, perhaps, that were doing similar listening projects so that we could connect with them and say, this is what we're learning as we're going through it. So I think that's the only thing I do a little differently. But I think for me, there was such magic in learning from the folks who showed up that now I'm just like, ooh, well, when can we invite another group? And when can we hear from another crew of people once we've gotten through, you know, the strategy that developed out of this enormous process. Cool. So I'm seeing some thank yous in the chat, and appreciate that so much for sharing that. And I wanted to see if we've got any questions. Mark, we see your hand raised. Go ahead and unmute yourself and ask your question.
Thank you, Marsha. I just want to thank you all for this, and also apologize. I missed the first maybe half hour and maybe 40 minutes, which I know are critical. And I'm the founder of the Denver Basic Income Project, and I'm grappling with many of these same issues. So I really appreciate this discussion and the wisdom that you've shared. And as we go through this process, and as we're moving in the direction towards community governance models and exploring how to do what Libby so beautifully stated, is to own it, not just talk about it. I'd really be curious, and if this, I'll rewatch the recording if it's at the beginning, you can just tell me that, but I'm interested in any models or tools or resources that you think were useful for you that could help us as we go through this process.
Mark, to clarify, do you mean useful tools as you engage in the research, or when you're thinking about implementation and going into the action phase?
Yeah, just in the kind of the discovery process and how to come to the direction that you're seeking. So you may have covered it at the beginning. If so, I apologize for coming back to it, but I would love to then follow up and just have as much guidance or maybe some follow-up conversations later as well, if it's possible.
Yeah, totally open to follow-up conversations, but I think that's a good question. I don't know that we dove too deeply into how did you get from the like what are some necessary tools for the research process and the implementation process. I'm going to let Tamiko or Beth start off there as our experts.
Marsha, could you repeat that last question that you just said?
Yeah, I think it's what resources and tools will help you through the research process or through the implementation process. Are there specific tools that people should be using?
I'm going to say relationships are more important than tools. Like I'm trying to answer the tools question and I'm like, actually, I think relationships first, and analysis first. And then I'll mute myself again when I think about tools.
Can you say more about the analysis part though? I think, I don't know that that was the part that we did internally, but I think that's an important point you're uplifting. Why is analysis important as well?
Do you want to answer that, Tamiko, or you want me to? I mean, either way.
I'm fine to start us off. So I think that analysis is a tool. And I think that one of the reasons why I think this work was particularly impactful, and I've done community research in other contexts, but one of the reasons why it was so impactful is the analysis work that staff was doing internally. And so this is just to give you an idea, what do we mean by power? What do we mean by privilege? What do we mean by oppression? What do we mean by liberation? And while there's not like a succinct, this is what we mean, but coming up with these collective definitions of these concepts, and then being able to bring that to the trusted advisors. And so folks, when they're having these conversations, are able to more mean some of the same, when we use this language, that we're meaning some of the same things. And so I think that because Tzedek was in a year-long pause, and while there was still, funding happening, but there was, it was really like a Cadillac version of community research process, because we were actually really able to take the time and the intention to do that analysis building work, which I think that it also enabled folks to be ready to respond to what was learned. And so, so I do think that that analysis work is a tool. And I think that I agree with Beth that what is most important to remember is that community research is rooted in relationship, and that it is an opportunity and a vehicle for being able to bring relationships or deepen relationships, having funders sit in the circle with community, but then also community being in a circle with each other. So I don't like to use the idea of humans as tools, but I think the relationship building is also a tool that I think is essential. So that's what I think that's what I'm thinking about. I don't know what you would add, Beth.
Yeah, I like thinking of the analysis building as a tool, like using a tool to build like shared language, because we did a lot of that internally with Tzedek. And I'm thinking about like right now, in the year since, Tamiko and I have done a lot of strategy work with other groups, and the groups that have been willing to put in the time to do some analysis building and some learning around systems of oppression and power and white supremacy culture specifically, have been able to create more transformative strategy together, because they have shared language, they're grounded in shared understanding of the world and the way the world works. And so that allows them to create better strategy. And I think that Tzedek did that, and that showed in the work.
I think that the thing it makes me think of is, I've been a part of a lot of other strategy processes for nonprofits and other institutions. And I just want to, highlight how important that analysis building is, because often you'll get through a strategy building process and some people are trying to, working towards diversity, and some folks are working towards equity, and you don't really know it until you're in the middle of the process. And then you start to have all these conflicts, and you're realizing that some of us are trying to, increase access to inequitable systems, and some of us are trying to dismantle inequitable systems, and that's a very different approach, right? And one of the things that I loved about the analysis building process, that you did it with us as an organization, and then we also did it again with the trusted advisors, is that we could all kind of feel comfortable. I think that was part of the building trust. We could then all feel comfortable that we knew we were aiming towards the same thing. Right, that we knew that we were all assuming that like white supremacy and capitalism are just oppressive structures that we need to dismantle, and we're trying to build like small steps as we get towards there. Yeah.
Hey, Marsha, can I ask you one more thing about it?
Sure.
The other thing I think, like, as as I really sit with the question about tools, I'm like, well, I don't think of myself as a researcher. I think of myself as a facilitator. And so I think facilitation tools were important in that.
Yes. Yes.
I think of Tamiko also as a facilitator and a researcher. She has more formal academic background in research, community research than I do. But facilitation tools, particularly tools around embodiment in the work, were really important. And I think this is a moment where I want to name Heather Lane Talley, who was part of the process, as the person who brought embodiment practices in that I think were really critical in learning occurring, because she was able to sometimes remind us to actually absorb the learning in our bodies as it was happening. And so I just can hear her being like, woo, when some big thing was named. And like, she would take the moment to absorb it herself, which gave other people permission to do that too. And that's that's a part of who she is, but it's also, that's a tool of working with groups to like make space for people to have embodied experiences of learning. And so we tried to do that. We tried to do we use facilitation tools to build relationships, to create space. Like we built altars. And I think it's part of my own internalized white supremacy that I don't think of those as tools, but they're facilitation tools.
I think that one thing that, like, if people want to do this, Asheville's a small-ish community, but even in bigger places, one of the things that, I mean, Tamiko and Beth both brought strong facilitation skills, strong relational skills, the research skills, design skills, but also both of you have been activists or involved in grassroots organizations in Asheville. So there's that lived experience, and there's all those relationships too. And so there was information coming through you, just through your experience on so many different levels. And I'm really glad that we worked with you. It was a great opportunity for us. And I know that there's got to be other people who can do this, because we can't just clone you and send you everywhere.
You know,
oh, go ahead.
Yeah, I know the question was about tools. I feel like we keep saying it's about tools, but this is what I actually think is more important. I think from a strategy standpoint, this has to be a process, especially if you're going to step into taking action and implementation. This has to be a process that the major decision makers in your organization are a part of. We were a small enough organization that we could pull everyone into the room. And so, you know, I think larger organizations have like boards, kind of larger boards that are separated from their staff, a leadership team, the ED essentially. So if you're an organization that's thinking about implementing this, it can't be something that's just being implemented by like your frontline staff. The folks who actually are holding decision-making power have to be part of the process, because when it comes down to implementation, if they weren't there to help build the relationships, it's going to be really, really hard for them to just be able to take action on what emerges. And unlike other processes that happen with the consultant, where the consultant just gives you a report and then you pass it along to your ED or your board and you say, implement this. We did get a report, but I would say that the ability to implement it came from the fact that we were all also deeply engaged in the process. So when things emerged in the report, we could understand where it came from. And we also had relationships enough with the folks who were being asked for their information that we could kind of loop back around and ask them to be resources as we went through. So I think making sure that, unlike other, processes with a consultant, that you have the people who can actually make the decisions in the space. That's really important. Tamiko, one last thing, and then there's a question in the chat I want us to address.
Yeah, I just wanted to address like a technical decision that we made. So sometimes, with strategic planning, where you can have a bunch of different people who are on the board go out and interview people, and they're not necessarily transcribing every word, but they're summarizing, capturing bullet points of what's been named. And we made a decision to transcribe every single word. And part of that decision, and we took the step of doing our very best to remove identifying information. And then that was a promise that we made to folks that were interviewed. And yeah, and so the choice between transcription or just take notes was one that took some conversation. And there's different approaches. There's so many different ways of presenting back findings, and so many different ways of gathering data. And so I think if you're trying to explore doing participatory research at your organization, that just looking at all the different approaches and models out there, because there's so many different ways to do it. So I just wanted to name that.
So Kathy had a question that she put in the chat about how did we deal with any conflict as it may have arisen in the process?
We didn't ignore it. We, you know, it changed agendas. It showed up in meetings. I mean, I think we waded into it, and we had a group of people who are willing to wade into it. That's my perspective as a facilitator. I would love to hear what participants thought.
Amy, you want to jump in on this? How did you feel about the conflict? How did you deal? Unmute, yeah.
It was pretty interesting for me, given my socialization and conditioning as at least a formally conflict avoidant person. I learned a lot, and I think I had an outburst at least once, which I hadn't expected, but I think that it ended up being generative. I think we learned things about each other. And I wonder if if Lindsay has a comment too. I think if she's still on the call, I think that, yeah, I don't think I have anything else to say. Except that if that hadn't happened, I don't think that Tzedek would have developed the strength and the internal strength that it has today.
Yeah. I think we had an approach to conflict, and this is something where from our co-director, Heather Lane Talley, I want to bring her into the room again, that she and I both, and I think the whole team embraced this, have a view that conflict is not, doesn't necessarily mean the end of relationship. That if you do conflict right, what you're actually doing is building intimacy and building an understanding with each other. And so on the other end of conflict, it is possible that you actually feel closer and more aligned than you did prior to conflict. And so what that did is kind of gave us all the incentive to stay in the conversation, right? And so we would, even between meetings that Tamiko and Beth facilitated, we would come back around and be like, look, you said this thing, here's how it landed for me. We tried as much as possible to use nonviolent communication as we went through that. But we really understood that if we didn't work it through in that moment when the opportunity arose, that we were going to be left with, a lot of unresolved conflict that was going to get in the way in the future. So if anything, how we dealt with conflict had a lot to do with, we had to have a frame shift and rethink of what conflict meant. That conflict didn't mean that we couldn't work together. Conflict didn't mean that we hated each other. Conflict meant that we had some feelings and different thoughts about the information, and we were going to sit with each other until we figured it out. And so I would say that if you're in a organization that's kind of conflict avoidant, that might be a place where you want to skill build it and increase your capacity as well, so that you can have the honest conversations that are required as part of this process. Cool. Any other thoughts?
And that all the work around relationship building that nobody wants to spend the time on is what allows you to do the conflict in the way that you and Heather were both willing to do, and everyone ended up being willing to do, but like building the relationships as a container for that, it's like a reason for that, is absolutely critical, I think.
Well, great. I mean, I think I've heard some really amazing things, even as someone who was already part of the process. I appreciate all of you for showing up and sharing honestly and transparently, as you always do. And there are also, I think, some folks putting some thank yous in the chat. We appreciate everyone for being here and part of this process. We'd love for folks who are here as part of our closing round, maybe put down some, write down in the chat something that a major takeaway from this conversation. We'd love to hear that in the chat. And as you're doing that, I just want to remind you that this is the first in a series of 4 webinars. We're going to be diving deep into what emerged in the research, sharing some of that information, and then sharing in more detailed ways how we made some of those individual changes. So thank you so much, y'all, for being here.